Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be discussing the concept of liquid democracy, or Democracy 3.0, with David Ernst. David is an entrepreneur and technologist advocating for and working to build the infrastructure to support liquid democracy, which is a combination of direct and representative democracy in which voters can choose to vote directly on legislation or can delegate their votes on any issue to someone who they feel is more capable or qualified to make those decisions. David's current major project is Secure Internet Voting, or CIV, which promises to offer fast, private, and verifiable internet voting. He also runs Democracy Space and hosts the Liquid Future podcast, which explores Democracy 3.0 and other visions for the future of government and society. In this conversation, we discuss how liquid democracy can be implemented today with no changes to law, the value of specialization and its role in decision-making, the failures of partisanship, the possibility of AI making political decisions, and much more. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review to let us know that you're listening. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. We are still offering the opportunity to send your digital files and photos to the surface of the moon on board Astrobotic's first lunar mission. To find out more and to get involved, visit futuregrind.org/moon. That's futuregrind.org/moon. Because of you, this is Future Grind. Now we are here with David. David, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be exploring a concept known as liquid democracy, which you have been championing for quite a while. And there are a few different types of democracy that people might be familiar with. There's, of course, direct democracy, in which individuals vote on things directly. And then there's representative democracy, in which people vote for and elect representatives to advocate for their view in government. How does liquid democracy fit into this?
Yeah, great question. It's oftentimes referred to as a hybrid of both systems, and so it tries to bring in the best aspects of both systems. Direct democracy is the ideal, is that everyone is a free and equal citizen, and so we deserve to have a voice, idea of the consent of the governed and all that, the ideas of a free society. And that's a beautiful idea. But on the reverse side of that, we're all really busy and law is complicated and statutes are complicated. And we all have many things to worry about. So the idea of all of us spending all of our time studying everything is quite a high bar. And so then we bring in the idea of representatives, which is really great, where we can say, okay, we have these trusted members of our community who can be dedicated, ideally full-time, although many legislatures are part-time positions as well, but they can really study the issues for us and think about things in a really thoughtful way. And so both of these ideas are beautiful, and there's kind of this tension in many ways between the two. And so the liquid democratic model is really trying to resolve that tension and kind of break this false dichotomy between like the people versus the experts, and really empower trustworthy experts, but in a way that's ultimately still just as accountable, if not much more accountable to the people. And the way that I really like to frame it myself, so everything I told you is really the way it was introduced to me, but the way that I think about it now is that this is really part of a historical trend. So the democracy, the idea of democracy itself goes back to ancient Athens. It's a Greek word going back 2,500 years. And so that was a direct democracy system. And all the citizens, all the members of Athens would meet together in person and vote in person. And so it was a revolutionary idea, a game-changing idea. Instead of having kings and monarchs and dictators and autocrats, and it can work really well on a small scale. And so today we still see democracies on small scales all over the place with these direct systems. The biggest problem is just that it gets really challenging as it tries to scale up. And so then we have this innovation that came along at a certain point of electing representatives for us. And the elections are really the mechanism that we use to pick the representatives. And so I like to think of this as democracy version 2. So instead of using the terms just direct democracy and representative democracy, I really like thinking of the second one as electoral representative democracy, because it's not the only system that can have representatives. There's all sorts of other ways that you can go about picking representatives, but it's really about elections, holding elections where a few candidates face off and one person wins. And so that's version 2. That's like 18th century democracy, 1776 democracy. And so it has all sorts of powerful things that it's accomplished, and it's created much of the world we live in, and people living in autocracies and monarchies in many cases yearn to become part of a free society. But now we also live in a different age. Now we live in the age of these smartphones and the internet and incredibly fast and powerful computers that we all have relatively easy access to. And so the information technology has changed, our infrastructure has changed so much. And so this really opens the door to what I think of as democracy 3. And so there's this historical trend line of 2,500-year-old democracy, ancient democracy is the direct system. And then our electoral representative system is like this pre-industrial age, as we're starting to spread out to these large countries. And now we live in a world that's densely much more populated, much faster communication speeds, much higher rates of literacy, and everybody seeing the updates and just being able to interact in real time all around the world. And so now we have the opportunity to realize 21st century democracy, information age democracy. And that's really how I think about it. It's part of this journey of realizing this idea of how free people can organize themselves and improving the system based on the tools we have available for us now.
And how does that play out in practice? You made it seem like this is a combination of the best qualities of both direct democracy and representative or electoral democracy. But what does that look like, and how does it work?
Yeah, very specifically, just at the core of it, there's this very simple mechanism that really powers the whole idea. And the idea is, like in a direct democracy, every last citizen, every legitimized citizen can vote on law. So just like right now, we have our congresspeople and our senators and our city council members voting yay or nay in favor or against various bills or different legislative actions. In a liquid democratic system, every last citizen can do that. But we don't necessarily always want to do that. And so we've also, as individuals, we're empowered to pick personal representatives who we personally chose ourselves rather than having elections where just one person is the representative for a million people. And anytime you don't vote on a policy, your representative, however they voted, you copy that position. It's like as if they get to vote on your behalf. And so your representative becomes like your backup. It's like if you're not able to be home, you might ask your neighbor to pick up your newspaper or water your plants or look after your pets. It's who's the people you trust to look after you. It's the same idea, but who's the people that you trust to look after your voice in our public forums, in our legislatures, in our assemblies for our republic. And so it's that very simple mechanism of you can vote directly. If you don't vote, your personally chosen representatives, your proxies, your delegates, all different names for the same thing, they get your extra voting power on your behalf. And so it introduces this powerful idea of voting power, where all of us start out with voting power of 1, and as more and more people trust us, our voting power is increasing to 5 to 10 to 1,000, and it could reach up to the scales our current legislature have, where our senators are sometimes representing millions or even tens of millions of people each.
So let's get into that delegation or proxy process a little bit more, because I think it's perhaps the most important piece here. And
Right.
as an example, perhaps, let's say that I am an expert on foreign policy matters, but I am not an expert on public health matters. I have a friend who went to med school, so I could choose to vote directly on issues dealing with foreign policy, but delegate my vote on public health issues to my friend. And let's say my friend knows someone else who knows more than him, perhaps the dean of that medical school. He could pass both of our votes along to the dean of the medical school. So ideally, it keeps getting passed up to people who are more and more expert and recognized as experts in these areas. Is this the general idea of how this works?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this sort of thing is already happening, of course. When we have some nuanced trade issue or nuanced healthcare issue or nuanced tax issue, we can look to the people in our lives that know these topics better, and they're already looking at people that they know who know the topic even better than them. And so we already have this implicit structure of who are the people we trust and who are the people they trust and so on and so forth. And this is just giving us the opportunity to make that power structure more explicit and giving us the control to really see how these representatives are voting and to be able to overrule them at any time, take back our vote on that individual issue or for all issues. If we decide they're no longer doing a great job, we're not stuck with them for years and years. We can say, look, you're not doing what I'm looking for out of my representative. I'm going to switch it to other people. And you don't even need their permission for that. You can just do it in real time as easily as you unfollow somebody on your favorite social media app.
So I think one thing that this could potentially address is the problem we're currently facing with the partisan system we have in America, where there's often a right team and a left team, or a red team and a blue team. And when people side with their team, they consider their team to be right on all matters and the other team to be the enemy on all matters. And I think this is leading to polarization, which is definitely harming the country. How do you view the issue of partisan politics, and how does liquid democracy fit into that?
Yeah. I mean, you're really hitting on something really core here. That's quite frankly, it's choking our country. I mean, it's strangling any sort of reasonable conversation. To reduce all the issues we face, of which there's many thousands uncountable issues across all different levels, to just this extremely simple binary, it's really absurd when you think about it. It's having a really harmful effect upon us as a community and upon us as individuals. I like to think of this line: partisanship is the mind killer. Because exactly like you say, when we start thinking in terms of our team versus their team, our critical thinking ability just goes out the window. It's no longer about what is right, but it becomes like, oh, well, these are our people, so I'm going to excuse them no matter what. And these other sides are the enemy, so I'm going to assume they did wrong no matter what. And that's a bias that many of us are all suffering from, and is not allowing us to see the world as it really is and think as clearly as we really could be. And so it's really harming us as individuals. And the thing is that it's actually really structural. The reason we have two parties has to do with the way that we're allowed to cast our vote, because we can only vote for one candidate out of a selection. Even if we have 10 choices, you can only vote for one, and whoever the top candidate is wins. That creates this really, really strong game theory pressure. It creates this massive handicap to the two frontrunners. So any other candidate up there, even if they're strong, they face all these accusations of being a spoiler, and there's all this talk of lesser of two evils, and people are admonished for not wasting their vote. And it's really frustrating because, of course, we don't want to vote for the lesser of two evils. We want to vote for an angel. Why should we be voting for an evil? But the fact is, the rules themselves actually do entrench this. We're not just imagining it. This isn't just a weird thing that we say. The rules, as they're currently written, really do have this duopoly forcing mechanism built into them. And so there are a number of ways that we could overcome that, allowing for more options. And a delegative democracy system, a liquid democracy system, is one of them, where we can just have many more options. It's no longer this winner take all choice for within elections. And the other thing is that for many people, again, we live busy lives. All these topics are dense. Very few people can spend more than an hour every day studying these issues. And quite frankly, you need many more than 24 hours every day just to keep up on all of it. And so we use the R and the D as a shorthand. We use them as a shortcut, as this heuristic, really, to simplify our thinking on the issue. Because we just have such information overload, it's much easier to just say, oh, well, in general, I trust this team, I trust this party. And so we're basically doing a very similar thing. We're basically delegating to the parties in this implicit way because the system only gives us two options. And so the whole vision of liquid democracy is to take these natural desires. We want to be able to trust people, but to give us many more options. And as you were sort of pointing out before, to really be able to break it out into different issue areas as well. So to be able to say, well, here are the people that I really trust when it comes to technology issues. And here's who I trust when it comes to tax issues. And here's who I trust when it comes to foreign policy issues versus healthcare issues. Because the fact is, we all have different strengths and weaknesses and areas of interest and things that we know a lot about. We just take it for granted in our private life that we're all going to specialize. I mean, the clothes we're wearing in most cases were made by somebody else. The food we're eating was grown by somebody else. The computers we're using to conduct this interview were made by thousands, if not millions of people, each with their own individual specialized job. And so specialization is really powerful. It gives us incredible leverage. And so liquid democracy allows us to bring in that exact same tool and power for the issues we face as a public, for the problems we face as a community, the things that we wish to address together using the tools of government. Does that make sense?
It does. And one thing about liquid democracy that I think makes it very interesting and more appealing than perhaps other proposed changes to our governmental decision-making process is that it can be implemented today at various levels of government without passing any legislation or changing any law. And it can be tested and piloted in certain legislative districts while keeping the rest of the system as it currently exists. Talk about this a bit more. How can we go about using aspects of liquid democracy today?
Yeah. To be frank, this is really the key thing that got me so excited and why this topic has taken over my life for the last half decade. It was this realization. I mean, as you say, there are a lot of other reform ideas out there. Some of them don't make all that much sense, but many of them are extremely promising and extremely worth trying out. But the challenge with the vast majority of reform ideas is that they require something resembling like a constitutional amendment or some like top-down level change where you need all of the people currently in power to agree to adopt this reform. And so if it's a great reform idea, that's one thing, but then you have this added step of actually being able to enact it, and that's challenging. And so what's really unique and really exciting about delegative democracy and this new potential is that there's this path where you can do it with just getting a single elected representative to join you. Just to give you an example, if you have, let's say you have a 15-person city council, rather than expecting all 15 members or the majority of the 15 members to pass your preferred reform, you could have just a single council member who's really excited about this new vision to represent the community better and empower the leaders in the community better. And that single council member can say, look, for our district, I'm going to start using this sort of system to guide all of my decisions. And so today, right now, we can start doing this. And so that's really where I came into the picture. I saw this potential, and I was sharing this with my friends and family about this new vision, and people were so excited. And one of the challenges was just that there wasn't really easy to use technology to make it possible, because all of this really is empowered by the technology available. And so based on my background, that seemed like something that I could especially help with. And so that's what me and my team has been doing for the last few years, building really easy to use technology so that citizens can start playing with this and experimenting with this, and elected representatives can start participating in this. and we can start doing this immediately without needing to pass any new laws.
So, you mentioned this was taking up the last half decade of your life. How did you find out about this and get so involved with it? And what was your background before that gave you the skill sets that you needed to do this?
Yeah, I'll start with the background piece. I grew up in a very political family. I grew up with politics and the legislative process all around me every day. It was a common discussion at the dinner table. My father was the city attorney of Dallas, which is like the sixth or seventh largest city in the US. And so he would sit in the city council meeting every week, and his clients, to use the legal term, were the 15 city council members. And so I sort of had this extremely close sideline seat to the legislative process. And so that's a huge advantage that allowed me to see how the process worked and how that could be improved. And it's the same on my mother's side of the family as well. She was also a government attorney, a civil rights attorney at the Department of Justice. And her father was a state senator in Vermont and a head of the government department at Dartmouth University. And so this was just sort of second nature for me, as structure of government and all these sorts of things. And then the added advantage, the really unique combination I think that I'm really blessed with, is that I also grew up with computers around me. And so I was programming from a very young age. And so I was exposed early on to the power of technology. And so that's really what this is about, is sort of realizing what the very fast and very well connected computers allow us to do and how that can intersect with the legal, legislative government system. And so then fast forward to, this was around 2016. I was working full time on some exciting technologies around some AI and finance technologies. And on the side, I was working on some political engagement tools. And this was just so happened right to be around the time that the Ethereum project had just launched and was doing really powerful work with decentralized programs, trustworthy programs using decentralized infrastructure and powerful cryptography for integrity checks. And in particular, they had just launched this program, or this they refer to it as a decentralized autonomous organization, and the project was actually called the DAO, DAO. And overnight, anonymous people had sent it $70 million worth of cryptocurrency, which today in 2020, surprisingly, doesn't seem like that much, because the market has only grown 2 more orders of magnitude since then. But at the time, this was a major event. It was like overnight this happened. It was 10 times larger than the largest crowdfunding project had ever been in history before that. And so there was something really interesting happening there. And so we saw that, and part of the big innovation of the project was that it allowed multiple people to vote on what sort of sub-projects they thought were the most interesting and wanted to fund. And it had this whole voting mechanism work in a decentralized way where everybody can trust the results and the process much more cleanly. And so that was really inspirational. And so my friends and I were looking at that and thinking, are there aspects of this that we can build off of? Although we weren't necessarily as interested in funding the sub-projects in the way that one was, we were interested in using it for more like participatory democracy projects. We had been vaguely introduced to it, but we really took a second look and a deeper look into the existing work on liquid democracy, and it really captured our attention. Not just the vision of the long-term vision of where it can go, but also this go-to-market strategy of being able to work with individual representatives that can opt in. Particularly, you could have this idea of what are sometimes referred to as liquid democracy candidates, who are people that run for office who say, if I get elected, I will just be a vessel for this new system. So you're not really voting for me, you're just voting for this new way of organizing. And on every single bill that comes before me, I'll vote the way the system, all of us, all of our neighbors, democratically decide. And so that, to me, really changes the game and allows for this new option. Instead of candidate A versus candidate B, well, now you have candidate Z who can perfectly represent the wishes of the community and can take part and can still be a member of the liquid democracy themselves and still have a big role to play in negotiation and seeing this firsthand view at all the debates of every day. But it just seems like it opens up this incredibly powerful new way to represent people much better. And so this really captured our attention. And as we started working on it, people were more and more excited and people's eyes would just light up. And it's really remarkable. And that's really fueled my involvement over the last few years.
So I want to build off of what you just said there, but very briefly, you mentioned that you had come across the existing work on liquid democracy. Can you talk a bit about where this idea originated from, how far back it goes, and just how it got to its current point?
Yeah. So this was in 2016. And in particular, there was this one essay by a man named Jordan Greenhall. And then there had been a bunch of previous work led by the Partido de la Red, which is Spanish for the Net Party, centered originally in Argentina, doing similar work around creating software for citizens to weigh in and then running candidates for office who would let citizens vote on that. So that was also a big part of that was Santiago Siri, who has been leading the Democracy Earth project for many years, recreating these systems on Ethereum and the blockchain. And before that, there had been some really interesting work by the Swedish Pirate Party and the German Pirate Party in particular, who started out of like the copy left movement and have these people that got elected specifically on copy left ideas, but once they were elected to parliament, they said, wait, now they're asking us to vote on all these other things, and all we know we care about is intellectual property issues, but there's all these other issues we're being asked to vote on, but we know we like peer-to-peer systems. And so they had been doing many experiments for many years of empowering the members of the Pirate Party to use these peer-to-peer liquid democracy systems to direct these legislators. There have been similar experiments in Iceland and Australia and a few other people in the US. But the idea, the word itself, liquid democracy, went back about almost 20 years. There was another paper that was exploring this in a military context, actually. The idea being that the military has this extremely hierarchical order from the commander-in-chief to the generals to the majors and then the lieutenants and the various commanding officers all the way down this chain of command that actually came out of a feudal system. Of course, the commander-in-chief is the parallel to the king, and the earls parallel the generals, and the dukes the majors, and so on. And so this person's idea was, could you use a peer-to-peer representative system where we empower leaders in a bottoms-up way rather than a top-down way, but in such an environment where you depend on speed, where it's really a life or death situation. So they had written a lot about that. And that's where I believe the term liquid democracy was first used. And then before that was the work of a professor, a PhD based out of Europe named Brian Ford, who had written his PhD paper on his thesis on what he called delegative democracy. And I believe that's actually the first thing that pinned down this idea of you can vote directly, and if you don't vote, your vote gets transferred to your proxies. And that was around the year 2002 or so. And so he's been doing a lot of really powerful work on this stuff ever since, out of his academic lab based in Switzerland. And then there are some reminiscent ideas going back even longer. There was a cool paper written by the Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland and also did a lot of really interesting mathematical work, where he talked about voting power accumulating through a proxy system, although it wasn't quite as detailed. And then going back even 250 years to the French Revolution, there's this document called the Declaration of the Rights of Citizen and Man. It has this line, law is the product of the general will. All citizens, either directly or through their representatives, should have a say in it, which really captured this exact same idea going back hundreds of years to revolutionary France. and the same sort of movement that inspired the American Revolution. So the point is, from an intellectual level, these ideas go back hundreds of years, and from a technological level and specifics, it's only really become possible in the last, in the 21st century, since computers have become much faster and ubiquitous and much smaller and affordable.
Yeah, you brought up a great point there, which is that while ideas like this may have existed for centuries, they've only recently become technologically possible to implement. And the biggest question that comes up when we talk about electronic voting platforms, and for very good reason, is security. How can we make sure that the votes being cast are legitimate and are being recorded and reported accurately? And this question goes beyond liquid democracy and applies to our current voting system as well. We're seeing voting lines that are many hours long in the midst of a deadly global pandemic, and we're seeing numerous issues and concerns around mail in voting. And electronic voting could address many of these problems. How can we make sure that that is safe and secure no matter what system we're using?
Yeah, this is an amazing question and really gets to the heart of it. Once people understand the vision of delegate democracy and 21st century democracy, this is oftentimes one of the top questions that comes up is, well, but wait, but how can we vote safely electronically? We can't even vote in our current elections electronically. And so it's interesting because voting itself on the surface seems like a very simple thing. When we're choosing between one of four candidates and maybe there's 10 different things on our ballot to decide, the actual amount of information we're sending up is only a few bits. It's just a tiny amount of information, much smaller than even a text message. A single text message is a kilobyte. Well, it's something like that. It's 160 bytes, whatever it is. But compared to a YouTube video, which could be many megabytes, or streaming Netflix, or downloading a new game, which is gigabytes, I mean, these are millions of times larger than the act of voting. And yet the act of voting is extremely difficult, as you're pointing out, and also extremely costly. I mean, that's the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the governments, when they're running the election, they have to spend a massive amount of money on election administration. And so the way it works in the US, every local jurisdiction runs their own election. Every county runs their own election. So there's over 8,000 of those throughout the US. And there's some state level guidance and a little bit of federal guidance, but mostly state level. And every county is spending millions of dollars per election just to administer the election, just to print the ballots and reserve the locations and pay the staff, all the poll workers. And if it's mail-in voting, sending out all the ballots. And then when they receive all the ballots for mail-in voting, they have to do this special process when they open them to ensure secrecy and confirm everybody's identities, and counting all the ballots. And they buy expensive machines, all expensive voting machines that governments will spend millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars on. So voting itself seems like a very simple problem, but under the hood, there's actually quite a lot of problems there in terms of verification, which is the problem of making sure that our vote got entered correctly and making sure that it wasn't tampered with. And then there's also very strong secrecy requirements. According to the UN, there's this idea, and there's a long history in the US of the evolution of how this came about, that it's not considered a free election or a fair election unless you have a secret ballot, because people can be coerced. It's just not, you're not, the idea is you're not really giving your free choice unless it's secret. And so that adds an enormous amount of cost. It's quite easy to hold a public vote, but it requires a lot more logistics to do a private vote. And then the authentication, making sure that the people that are voting are allowed to vote and that they're only voting a single time, that again is a whole nother huge problem and has been all over the news lately. And so there's a number of problems in here. The good news is that every single one of these problems are solvable, and that I and my team have actually been working on a new solution specifically for governments, a program we call Secure Internet Voting. It's named exactly like what you'd expect out of it. So we call it SIV for short, SIV. like civilization, because we intend for this to be part of the foundation for civilization for the new digital world we're increasingly entering. And so in Civ, it's software that local governments can use, that we're producing for local governments to allow reliable internet voting. And it's much easier for voters. It's much faster. You can vote for the things that are on your ballot in the existing elections right from your phone or a tablet or your laptop or a desktop or even a borrowed computer. It could be a friend's device or a library device. You can use any computer at all. You don't have to install anything. It all works right in a browser, and it's all authenticated. So it works with the existing voter registration system. So there's a number of different ways you can implement it. So you can implement it in lighter ways for online only communities, but for governments, we're matching the same requirements as vote by mail. So it's at least as strong as vote by mail and has a number of options to add additional authentication layers as well to make it even stronger. And it's very fast. You can submit your vote basically at the speed of light, and you can get confirmation that your vote was received immediately. So we don't have all these problems with the postal system delays that have been all over the news the last few months. And it uses advanced encryption. It uses these really powerful ideas to create what's called a mix net. And it uses these cryptographic shuffles. And so you actually have provable privacy. Unlike vote by mail, with vote by mail, you don't actually know that your vote is secret. It's unfortunately somewhat easy for a postal worker or anyone in possession of your ballot to just open your ballot and look at it. And with in-person voting, ideally the same thing's happening, but unfortunately there are a number of reports of people's ballots being compromised. I'm not trying to fearmonger, but the point is that in our system, you actually have provable privacy. So each voter can actually be confident that no one, including the election administrator, can ever see how you voted. And that's a really fascinating mathematical problem that's built on top of decades of advanced cryptographic work and actually based on the work of all these Turing Award winners, which is extremely cool. And then it also has a verification system, which is really, at the end of the day, the key thing. And so each voter individually can actually see their final vote in the count. And so you can easily confirm that your vote was entered and counted correctly. And there's ways you can do what's called universal verifiability. So watchdog organizations and auditors and so on can confirm all the results of the election. So it's completely auditable from top down. It massively reduces costs. It's much easier for voters. It actually has better privacy and better verification, so you as a voter can be confident in the trustworthiness of your vote. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, we've been working very hard on it for the last few months, and we're starting some pilots in these upcoming months. We have 6 counties already that are excited to start pilots with us. So that's a really exciting thing. And again, it's called Civ. It's all available online at secureinternetvoting.org. We have a lot of information written that explains exactly how the protocol works and the research it's built on. And I really see this as like a stepping stone. It helps get us to this beautiful future that we're working towards, where we can all trust these systems much easier, and addresses this very real problem that we're all facing right now, especially exacerbated by the pandemic.
Well, I'm very excited that you're working on this because I see electronic voting as a major improvement that I think is bound to happen, and it just needs to happen in a way that people can be confident in it, and it sounds like you are building that, so I'm very excited to see that. So I'm going to be asking a bunch of questions now on the concept of liquid democracy in general, and I think it might be interesting to hear both how you're addressing these issues in the technological platforms that you are building, and also perhaps your thoughts on it more broadly. So first of all, one of my biggest concerns when it comes to liquid democracy is the potential for it to be overwhelmed by populism and mob rule. And in the United States, many of the founders were concerned about these risks as well. James Madison, writing in Federalist 58, talked about how larger assemblies were more likely to run by passion instead of reason, and that sophistry might win out over good arguments. These are criticisms that faced Athens back in the earliest days of direct democracy. Do you feel that these concerns are justified? And if so, how do you feel that liquid democracy can address them?
Yeah. So this is really the other big concern. The first concern is, can we do electronic voting securely? And the next concern is, can we trust people? Are people responsible enough to be given a voice? Do we want everyone to have a voice in our system? And these are really, at the end of the day, the two core, 90% of people, if they have a concern, it's one of these two concerns. And so I do think it's justified, absolutely. I mean, of course, we want the best outcome. There's a sort of tension with any governance system. You want the best outcomes on one hand, you want effective governance, and then you also want legitimacy on the other hand. You want a fair system where people feel like it's legitimate and they're free citizens. And so there is that tension there. And I think you're exactly right to your point about James Madison, the size of the assembly leading to problems, and the references to populism in ancient Athens. And that's really one of the reasons why I would again reemphasize that it's a misunderstanding to frame liquid democracy as equivalent to direct democracy. And not that you're specifically doing this, but many other people make this confusion. And it's one of the reasons why I actually personally don't even use the term liquid democracy all that much, because a lot of people think of it as just like quicker democracy, as just faster democracy, and that maybe it's not very stable, it's not very solid. And so I personally, over the years, have actually moved away from that term. And I like to even just think of it as just democracy. Sometimes 21st century democracy or democracy 3, or sometimes delegative democracy when I'm talking about the specific mechanism of you can vote directly or delegate to your proxy. And the key thing there is to point out, is to recognize that direct democracy would be moving backwards. Direct democracy would be moving back to more like an ancient Athenian system. And exactly like James Madison's pointing out, it doesn't necessarily scale all that well. It becomes really challenging. I mean, even just past a few hundred people, it becomes really challenging, getting into like Dunbar's number and all that. And so right now we're in democracy 2, and we want to move forward, not backwards. And so, you also brought up this word mob rule, and I think mob rule isn't exactly the right. Of course, mob rule is something to be concerned about, but I don't think that's actually what this is. Sometimes people associate it with that, but that's kind of the slur that comes from like autocratic entities, like autocratic propaganda arms will try to make people think of democracy as equivalent to mob rule. But mob rule is a very distinct thing. A mob rule is very, a mob is like, it is very much the passion of the moment, no rule of law, no trials, no legal process whatsoever. I mean, these are violent lynchings and burning things down and pogroms and so on. And that's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about empowering the legal system of how we vote and the legal system of how we pick representatives. And so being slippery with the words is just, it's a total misunderstanding. It's, these are two separate things. We want to have a legitimate legal process, not a mob rule at all. And so that really then gets into what is this all about? And again, it's really about empowering representatives. And so our current system already depends upon empowering representatives. We're already asking voters, who among these people do you trust? And we can already have good leaders and bad leaders. And we can see examples of where people are choosing candidates that in retrospect don't seem all that sensible. And so there's many great things about delegated democracy. And one of them is that you're not really stuck with those choices of representative for so many years. If in the heat of the moment, some crazy story comes out in the last minute and swings the election briefly one direction, these so-called October surprises, you're not stuck with that for years and years. And you can actually go pick the representative in any moment that you feel the strongest, would solve the issues we face the best, or has the best idea for how to address the issues we face. On top of that, you can get into these issue by issue areas of expertise. So I think we can actually have a drastically smarter representative system just for that reason alone, because our current system really depends on like this one size fits all representative where we're expecting these people to know everything about everything. We want any one of these people are supposed to fix all of our issues. which is just absurd. I mean, I can say that as a candidate myself. I ran for office in the California State Assembly, and I do these candidate forums and interviews and things, and I would just be asked the wildest range of issues, from I'm supposed to fix the entire California school system, to fixing all of the fires, to fixing homelessness, to fixing, this, that, and the other. And the point is that no human can possibly know everything about everything. And so we get a huge benefit just by allowing us to specialize better. And then the last point, and in many ways, even if none of the other points were true, this is also extremely convincing for me. So I want to dig into this, what you were saying about James Madison and the size of the assembly. There's this really, what I consider to be a really powerful idea out of the field of behavioral economics, looking at the personal psychology of voters and what is your cost-benefit analysis of voting. And not that every voter is going to do a cost-benefit analysis, but it's sort of implicit. It's always there in the background. And the basic idea, it has this title. It's called the low information voter problem, or the problem of the low information voter. And sometimes it's bandied about in these conversations around populism. The same idea is like, oh, populism is the result of these low information voters that are just voting based on their passions, that aren't really looking into the issues, aren't being thoughtful and based on reason, like Madison was saying. But the low information voter, actually, the idea from the academic literature is actually much more powerful than that. It's not just a slur or a slander against people's genetic intellect, but it's actually talking about the idea that when you are a member of a democratic body, your incentive for paying attention to the issues gets more and more reduced. It gets more and more diluted as the body gets larger. And so if you're just a simple example is to think, if you're buying a car for yourself, you're making this purchase and you're expecting to spend maybe tens of thousands of dollars on it, you're going to spend a certain amount of hours researching your options and going to a dealer, maybe multiple dealers, and doing test drives and being thoughtful about this decision. And so this is sort of the amount of time you're spending researching the issue. This is the cost to make your decision. And the benefit is that you're left with a great car, or, on the other end, maybe if you make a bad decision, you're left with a lemon. But the benefit of making the right decision is that you feel the impact in your life very clearly. And now if you're a member of a committee of a dozen people, well, now that benefit gets diluted between all the people, because even if you do all the research, if the other 11 people on the committee don't, well, you're still going to be overruled. And so every hour of research that you're doing doesn't go quite as far. It's getting diluted down and down. The benefit is basically 1 over the number of people in the body. And this is kind of terrifying when you stop and think about it, because what it implies is that as you get larger and larger bodies, you're going to see worse and worse decisions. Totally aside from the quality of the people themselves. I mean, even if all the people are super geniuses or all Einstein, you could expect 1 million Einsteins to make a worse decision when a vote is placed before them compared to just 100 Einsteins. And so this is the problem of the low information voter. And it really comes down to this like personal, individual decision you're faced with of like, well, how much does it matter for me to research the issue? And there's sort of this like tragedy of the commons, or like diffusion of responsibility effect, where you kind of think, well, if everyone else should be looking at it, or they're not looking at it, so I'm not going to look at it. And so this is really concerning. And so that's the current psychology, is like, well, you can either take your time to research it and then you have cast a good vote on behalf of 1 in a million people, or you can just say, I have other things that are more important, putting food on my table, or spending time with my family, or the other hobbies and interests I have in my life, and so I'm just going to opt out. Maybe I'm not even going to participate at all in the Democratic body. And so this is what we're seeing right now all around us. And this is really a scaling issue. It's a problem with as the bodies get larger and larger. And the thing to understand is that the original idea was that representatives would only have 30,000 constituents each, whereas now on the national level, they have 1 million constituents each. So every one of us, that the representative has 30 times as many constituents, and all of our representative power has been diluted down 30 times. this is why we need to move to a system better designed for the world we live in today, for the population we live in today, and using the tools available for us today, Democracy 3 system, because it can actually solve this problem of the low information voter. And the basic way to solve it is that, yeah, like when you're in a direct democracy, if you have to decide, should I cast my vote as one in a million, or should I, just opt out? That's a hard decision, especially as you get to a larger and larger body. I mean, here I am in California. We have 30 million residents, and we're being asked to vote on 20 different propositions in the next few weeks for this election. 20 different individual bills we're supposed to study, and they're written in very confusing ways intentionally to kind of mislead people. All different things there's a thing about dialysis law and healthcare, and there's laws around app drivers for Uber and DoorDash and so on. And there's a lot of tax policy law and education law. And every one of these is a dense topic. And so expecting everyone to understand every one of these is just unrealistic completely. And so that's why we have representatives. That's the whole idea of the representative system. This is the problem with direct democracy, is that it doesn't scale all that well. And so it's really powerful to be able to say, well, I trust the representative. They have staff. They can look into this. They can dedicate a lot more time. And they're going to cast their vote on behalf of many of us, thousands of us or millions of us. And so they understand that there's a lot more weighing on them to really get it right, rather than each one of us as individuals. And so liquid democracy is not at all direct democracy. It absolutely has a representative system. The representative system is extremely important. And for the vast majority of decisions, I mean, if we're being frank here, I suspect less than 1% of people will vote directly on any given issue. I mean, having representatives is great. And that's why this voting power is really fundamental, because then the calculus changes. Instead of saying, should I vote as one in a million people and spend all this time researching the issue, or should I just stay home and count as zero? And that's what it is in a current system, whether you're picking your representative in the election, which is effectively we elect our representatives directly, or you're voting on propositions. That's the current calculus. Instead, it becomes, should I cast my vote as maybe one person and study the issue with voting power of one? Or should I say, I'm not going to do it on this issue, and I can feel confident that the people I've chosen as my representatives can represent my voting power? And so the effect of that is that then we have this accumulating voting power. Maybe a few people trust you, so you actually could be voting on behalf of 5 or 10 people or 100 people. And now you have a much better incentive scheme to really look into the issue. And if you don't look into it, you have this much easier fallback where you can trust that your views will still be represented as closely as you were able to based on the representatives you chose. And so it completely cuts the knot, so to speak, the Gordian knot of this growing legislature size. And the theory is that it ought to scale drastically better than our current elective system does. And so that's really what we're trying to work towards.
So what's the balance between privacy and transparency when it comes to this type of democracy? When you brought up your secure internet voting project, you mentioned the importance and difficulty of both verifying identity and maintaining privacy and confidentiality. And this is very important in today's system. How individuals choose to vote is private, but when our elected representatives vote on issues on our behalf, those votes are public. And I think this is good because this transparency helps us to hold representatives accountable. But what does this mean for proxy and delegated votes in a liquid democracy system? I feel like you'd have to strike this balance between individual votes being able to remain private, while also providing a means of accountability for the proxy and delegate votes or actions. How do you view this, and how can it be addressed?
Yeah, this is a really great point and a great question. And you hit the nail on the head. It's exactly, we have this sort of bifurcated system where we as citizens expect privacy in our vote, but we expect all of our representative votes to be public so that we can make sure that they're representing us the way we want them to. They're working for us. I mean, we elected them to do the job we voted them in for, and so we need to know, should we reelect them or not? And so this wasn't a super clear question when we got started on this work. There had been a little bit of research. In particular, there's an internal liquid democracy system at Google, a system called Google Votes that they were using for internal corporate decisions, like how to spend their employee charity budget and what to serve in the company cafeteria. And so the people that had designed that system wrote a really interesting paper where they talked about how to do this privacy system. So they had done some really powerful work on this. But what we found, we did a number of different experiments, and through different designs, we hit upon something that people seem to really like, which is that when you cast a vote in our voting interface, we just give you the option, so you can explain why you're voting the way you are. You can vote yay, you can vote nay, or you can vote abstain, neither, neutral. And when you're casting that vote, you can also choose between if you want your vote to be a public vote with your name attached or to be a private vote. And then it just says, private voter in your jurisdiction voted this way. The point is that we leave it up to you as an individual on different issues, whether you want your stance on that issue to be public or not. And the trade-off is that if it is public, then it can be passed down to all the people delegating to you, all the people proxying to you. And so you see right in the interface the difference in your voting power options between when you vote privately or when you vote publicly. If you vote privately, your voting power can only possibly be 1. And if you vote publicly, your voting power will be all the people that are proxying to you that haven't cast a vote already and that don't, later come to overrule you, vote themselves. And so you get that trade-off because privacy is extremely important for many reasons. And it's really a human right at the end of the day. And we just want to kind of recreate this exact same system of representative votes need to be public, but you can always vote privately if you want. And if you want, you can vote privately and just go tell all your friends, hey, this is how I voted. Why don't, I think you should vote this way as well. And so you could do a sort of mixed system where you tell select people how to vote. And we could create tools to even streamline that process and make that automatic, but we've left that out. For now, we just have the very simple globally public with your name attached to it, or personally private, where you can still verify, you can still see that each vote gets like a tracking number, so you can see it in the final tally, but it's private and nobody else can see that it's yours or how you voted.
That's a pretty elegant solution there. I think that works out quite well. And we've already mentioned how people can delegate their votes to other individuals. But what about the idea of delegating your vote to an organization or a cause? I could see people wanting to delegate their vote to their union or perhaps their political party or some other organization or affiliation or something else. Is that something you can do, and what are the potential for this?
Yeah, completely. So the simple answer is that we're not really all that strict about who, in the system that we've created, and to be clear, this is sort of conceptual. The way I sort of think about it is that like liquid democracy as a model, it's sort of parallel to like the term social media. And so like the social media is like a whole class of things, but then you have specific instances of it. Like Facebook is one example of a social media platform, and Twitter is another, and Instagram is another, and Snapchat is another, and TikTok is another, and so on and so forth. So each one is going to have variations. So I can't necessarily speak to like a canonical rule, but I can speak to how what we've found people seem to respond the best to and seems the most in the spirit of the vision. And so to this particular question, I think that there's a huge amount of power in being able to have representatives that are, like you said, organizations. And so, that we're all, like I was saying earlier, we're already effectively sort of delegating to the parties when we just vote straight ticket. Our ballots even have that option. You can just mark one spot and then you automatically vote for all Republicans or all Democrats. And so that seems extremely natural to allow that as an option. The request we've actually gotten the most, just for coincidentally, take it as you will, a huge amount of people have asked us if they can delegate to the Sierra Club. So that's been the one that has come up the most. They see them as leaders on these conservation and environmental issues. And so organizations absolutely have positions. I mean, there's no question about it. Pick a political organization. They're going to make endorsements of ballot propositions and candidates and issues and so on and so forth. And so our view is really, we just want to make all of these existing positions very clear and easy. So like you can go in and you can see what is the official Democratic Party line on this issue, or the NRA's position on this issue, or so on or so forth. So the NRA has also come up a number of times as being one that people want to delegate to. And for that matter, you could imagine other personalities. I mean, right now the cost to start one of these organizations is relatively high, but once we make this digital, it really brings down the ability to start an organization. It's similar to like what YouTube has done for video production compared to the pre-internet age video, where you only had a tiny number of TV networks and so on. And so I suspect there'll be a lot of really fascinating experiments and people doing really great work to just explain what they think will solve problems, or community problems we face, and what's best for people, and why we ought to be voting one way or the other. And we just want to make it easy for each citizen to be represented by who they want to be represented by. And so you could even, we talked about organizations, but another topic that comes up sometimes is artificial intelligences. And so a lot of people will say like, oh, can you give us some prediction thing of who we ought to be voting for? Use some fancy technology to do that. I don't personally necessarily want to do that much of like our own first party recommendation, but I think it would be really great if other people are building their own versions of like, the Siri versus Alexa doing their best job to try to represent people. And then you have this much better dynamic where the innovators are coming up with the best system they can, but at the end of the day, it's still accountable to the citizens. The citizens still have to be happy with it and like it and choose to keep that as their representative. And so you can have a lot more competition and accountability in the system. And you can have a lot of other models as well. I mean, there's this popular idea of prediction markets known as futarchy, where you have investors kind of placing guesses on what sort of policy decisions will make the most people happy. And there's a lot of interesting academic work on why that might lead to more accurate outcomes to make more people happy. But many people don't understand that system. And so the beauty of this delegative democracy model is that it's extremely inclusive. The people that want to be represented by something like that can choose to be represented by something like that. And that can start, right now. And we don't have to force it on everyone that aren't ready for it or don't understand it, or for whatever reason, it's just not their preference. And so, yeah, to answer your question, there's a lot of options. We just want to give as many options as possible to each citizen.
We mentioned earlier that aspects of liquid democracy can be implemented today on a district-by-district basis with no change to existing laws or the electoral process. But I think we'd still have issues in that. Gerrymandering is a major problem, and even if every representative adhered to the expressed wishes of their constituents on each issue, gerrymandering can still game the system. But we could eradicate gerrymandering altogether. We could theoretically completely replace the House of Representatives, or even the president, with the complete will of the people, making decisions based on the results of the actual voting. This means that rather than making 700,000 individual voices lead to a single vote, as we do in the House, each vote counts for itself, and we'd no longer need these elected representatives at all. And we could do something similar in the Senate. If we decide the Senate is meant to represent the people, we could just eliminate it as well. If we decide it should still represent the state interests, we could give a single vote to each state and let that vote be cast by the will of the people in that state. This isn't something we've talked about so far. Everything we've said so far is working with the existing system, but what are your thoughts on the potential of just eliminating that altogether?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I definitely don't like gerrymandering. I mean, there's no question about it. From a philosophical point of view, it seems completely wrong that a politician could pick their voters rather than the voters picking the politician. That seems to totally destroy the idea of government by the people and consent of the governed, and really corrupts the system. And likewise with the Senate, I mean, it's unfortunate that we can't have reasonable conversations about this without it being cloaked in the two-party system of, is this good for the red team or bad for the red team, or good for the blue team or bad for the blue team, which is absurd. I mean, it really shouldn't be about the red team or the blue team. It should be about what's good for the country and good for all of us. And so this is yet another example of how this two-party duopoly is destroying reasonable conversation, and we really ought to do something about escaping our duopoly. But to your point about reforming the system in a more complete way, in general, yeah, I'm excited about it. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the challenge there are a lot of ideas for how to address gerrymandering. I think the most promising thing that's worked so far, it's worked quite well in a number of different states, is nonpartisan commissions to draw the state lines. There's been really interesting work out of Princeton. They have the Princeton Anti-Gerrymandering Lab, where they can kind of quantify how gerrymandered different districts are. And so there are some places where it's worse than others, and they have a lot of specific ideas and experienced action plans for how to address it. But again, the problem with all of these is just that they require the top-down reform. You need to get a majority of the people in power to go along with it. And in general, people that were elected by one system are against changing the system that put them in power. I mean, it's extremely rare for people to climb a ladder and then change the ladder that put them there, whether for malicious reasons or just because they don't even see the problem, because there's a sort of confirmation bias or like survivorship bias where it's like, well, I made it through it, what's the problem? And so I think the really powerful thing about these ideas about doing it on this district by district basis is that it allows us to not require such a large threshold, such a large critical mass to make these changes. And the cool thing is that you could also, the districts that chose to upgrade to a liquid democratic system could choose to basically blur their boundaries together. So you could imagine a law that passes just for the individual districts, let's say 3 districts that have all elected liquid candidates who are voting on all legislation as their local district's liquid democracy directs them to. You could imagine them passing a law that says we'll actually reallocate our own votes to more closely match the total popular vote within all of our districts. And so for an example bill, let's say the bill had 66 support in all 3 of the districts, in each of the 3 districts. Well, in a naive way, in the current system, because all 3 of them are above 51%, you'd have all 3 of the liquid candidates, all 3 of the vessels for the liquid system voting in that same way. But what you could do is you could say, look, we have 3 liquid candidates that want to reallocate their votes better on all bills. And so if it's at 66%, we will actually just smartly allocate where we have 2 of the candidates vote that direction and the other candidate vote the way of the 33%. And so the final votes in the legislature end up actually much more closely matching the vote of the population. And that's something that the individual districts can choose to do without requiring the other districts that aren't even excited about this system, aren't even ready to use the system. You don't need their permission. And just that permissionless nature of it is really powerful to let us just move in this direction orders of magnitude faster than trying to approach it in a top-down way. So I want to move in that direction. And the way that I see it, it's sort of like there's a transition process, working backwards. It's like we can start with individual districts. And this also lets us test these things out on a much smaller scale and a much safer scale, where if anything goes wrong, and of course things are never perfect, especially in the beginning, then it's isolated to just that one seat, which really isn't, legislatures are out sick constantly, sometimes even for months at a time. And so that gives us much more safety than trying to change the entire system overnight completely without any sort of backup. And so, yeah, if we go in this sort of bottoms up way, then we can be growing through our successes. And then once we have enough support that now we have a majority or a plurality of the districts that are supporting this sort of system, well then, yeah, by all means, let's codify it into the top-down law. At that point, you could pursue something like a constitutional amendment once you have 51%, or in the case of the Constitution, you actually need 75% support. But so I'm all in favor of working there, and it's just the question of what will get us there as effectively as possible.
Well, I've done a lot of playing devil's advocate in this conversation, trying to poke holes in the idea of liquid democracy. But the truth is, I'm very intrigued by this idea, and I think it has a lot of potential. And there are other things, such as ranked choice voting or star voting, that I also would like to see implemented. But I love the idea that this could happen today without changing any laws. So I totally support the idea of working on this and experimenting with it more. And if anyone in the audience wants to find out more or get involved and support this, how can they do that?
Yeah, and just to agree with you, I mean, this is an intriguing idea. We think there's something promising here, and so we want to just let more people know about it and make it possible for people to try it out and really gather more data. But we're trying to approach it in a very data driven way and not an ideological way whatsoever. And so we always welcome criticism. I mean, it only makes this stuff stronger. And to your point about other reform things, it's funny you name those ones in particular because we actually work closely with advocates of those, of ranked choice voting and star voting as an example. And they're very symbiotic because having ranked choice voting or having star voting makes it easier to elect liquid candidates and innovative out of the box candidates because, outside escaping the duopoly and getting out of the voting paradoxes. And vice versa, we've created a number of pieces of legislation on our liquid platform where residents in Washington in particular and around Portland as well have been voting to tell their legislatures to support these sorts of reforms, because historically these reforms have only really been all that successful in places that have ballot initiatives, which is unfortunately not, most districts do not have ballot initiative systems. And so by giving people a way to trustworthily vote on policy and sending that right to their representatives, we can help push these sorts of policy ideas that do have broad support. And so it's 100% symbiotic or mutually beneficial. So we're not, it's not at all zero sum, or we're not opposed to them in any sort of way whatsoever. And to your later point, how can people find out more? We have a website up at www.democracy.space where citizens can see exactly how this works. It's meant to be relatively easy. You can pick representatives, you can sign up and verify your identity, and we show bills at the national level and for some states and for some counties automatically. And people can add their own legislative ideas and start to build policy support for their own legislative ideas. And all the data there, all the votes there get sent automatically to your representative. So it's meant to be a much easier way to contact your representative for how you feel about different policy issues. On that website, if you scroll to the bottom on the homepage, we have a lot of articles written, and there's some videos of different talks that we've given and things like that. And we also started a podcast. So we have a podcast out. It's called Liquid Future, that has a lot of really fun interviews and solo episodes and explainer videos that interviews a lot of people working on democracy and academics and advocates and candidates and so on, people working on improving the democratic system at a meta level, at a systemic level. So that's been really fun. And so that's again called Liquid Future, and it's available on YouTube in video form and then in audio form and all the places podcasts are. I'm pretty accessible as well. I'm on Twitter at DS Ernst. And yeah, I think the more people talking about this stuff, the better. It's a big journey. And again, the framing it as democracy 3 and 21st century democracy is really the way I think about it. This is in many ways the biggest change we're talking about in 250 years. And so it's not going to happen overnight, nor should it, because we want to do it right and we want to do it safely. But the more people that know about it, the better. The more people experimenting with it, the better. And every day, more and more people are learning about it, and the enthusiasm is growing. And so that's really exciting. It's really cool that one thing that I've just found is that if people take the time to really stop and consider it and explore it, usually takes about 30 minutes or so before it kind of all clicks for them. But in my experience, something like 9 out of 10 people come out just saying, whoa, there's something really interesting here. And so there really is broad support. The idea is just like, how can we represent each other? How can we be free people? And so that's really exciting. But yeah, I'm really grateful to you for inviting me and hosting this interview and asking all these great questions and helping to get these ideas out to more people. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. And like I said, these are very important topics. And I think More people should be thinking about them and discussing them, and I will make sure to put links to everything we mentioned there and also throughout the rest of the show in the show notes at futuregrind.org. And David, thanks again for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been super fun.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with David. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast going. You can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. Till next time, this is Future Grind.